Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. My name is Kara Cook from the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments. This webinar is courtesy of our practice work group, and it's titled Green Teams 101. Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. We will go through the presentation and then we will get to questions at the end. To submit questions, just click on the right-hand side in the chat box, and then we will answer them at the end from our speaker. And this webinar is approved for one continuing education hour for nurses, and you will get an email with the link to the recording at the end, as well as a link to the evaluation. And when you complete the evaluation, the certificate will pop right up for your continuing education hours. And with that, I'll get started. Our speaker today is Dr. Beth Schenk, who is also our practice work group chair. Beth is a Providence WSU nurse scientist and sustainability coordinator at Providence St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula, Montana. In addition, she is assistant research professor in nursing at Washington State University. Dr. Schenk co-leads nursing research efforts at St. Pat's and also across Providence St. Joseph Health, working with nursing leaders at 50 hospitals. She is also a pioneer in the environmental stewardship and sustainability in hospital systems. So with that, I'll turn it over to Beth.
Thank you, Kara, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm excited to talk with you, and because of the shape or the structure of the webinar, it's kind of me talking at you, but there is opportunity for you to put questions in the chat box, and Kara will field those for us. And I have a lot of content to cover, so I'm going to go kind of fast through that, but I think we'll have time for some questions. The objectives today is that we can identify contributors to healthcare pollution, common elements of an environmental stewardship program, and nursing roles in that effort. So what is the problem? Basically, this is the problem. We have folks who have disease or illness. They access our services, healthcare services, but healthcare services creates healthcare pollution, and healthcare pollution then contributes to disease and illness. This is the kind of cycle we don't want to be a part of. And if you start at the bottom right, we know that healthcare focuses on reducing harm in many ways. For instance, high reliability organizations. We track our quality outcomes. We look at rankings, and some of our reimbursement is based on quality outcomes. We're very serious about that. Moving to the left, we also know that healthcare is not held accountable for its pollution. It's not required by law. It's not required, except for some EPA standards. It's not required by CMS. And except for the leading hospitals in the nation who are working on this, it's not regularly measured or reported. However, if you go to the top, healthcare pollution creates harm on the same order of magnitude as other healthcare acquired conditions. An important paper came out in 2016 by Eckelman and Sherman, and they calculated 10 years worth of healthcare pollution and then translated the health impacts of that in dailies or disability adjusted life years, and they found that it was of the same order of magnitude as all the other health care acquired conditions. So this is astonishing when we think about it that way, that we work hard to reduce our harm, yet we're causing about the same amount of harm in a way that we don't pay attention to, and that's healthcare generated pollution. So what is this healthcare generated pollution? This is just a little synopsis of healthcare's environmental footprint, and this won't be new news to anyone. First of all, thinking about energy, healthcare and especially hospitals are very energy intensive with 24/7 operations. That same study I referred to in 2016 found that 10% of the nation's greenhouse gases come from healthcare. Before that study, it was estimated at 8%, but they found that it was actually higher than we thought. Healthcare is considered the second highest user of energy, and that's in the service sector, and food is first. Hospitals themselves are 2 to 3 times as energy intensive as office buildings, and you know that if you've been in an ICU, a cath lab, an OR, an ER, and you've seen the wall-to-wall computers and equipment. And just to call out that related to energy because of greenhouse gases is that transportation is now outpacing buildings in terms of greenhouse gas contributions. Another piece of the footprint is the waste stream, and we're familiar with healthcare waste as nurses because we see it so much. These are just a few, these are the primary categories, and I lump them into regulated and non-regulated. Regulated includes infectious waste that you know about. It's also called red bag, regulated medical waste. There's also chemical RCRA, hazardous waste. That's EPA designated hazardous, and that stands for Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Then there's non-RCRA pharmaceutical waste. We still don't want those pharmaceuticals in our water, et cetera. There's narcotics and nuclear. Non-regulated includes municipal solid waste, recycling, compost waste, and unfortunately, waste anesthetic gas is non-regulated at this point. There's also other pieces of the waste stream in terms of diversion. So when we do giveaways or reuse of durable medical goods, device reprocessing is a very important aspect of waste, sensible waste use. And if you have global initiatives or other giveaways, that is a piece of the waste stream. These figures are from Practice Green Health, that we create 7,000 tons per day in the nation from healthcare, and that is 29 pounds per patient per day. The third category, in my way of thinking about this, is chemicals. And these are some of the chemicals of concern in healthcare, that healthcare has a higher amount than other industries, perhaps. Mercury, you know that from sphygmomanometers and thermometers over the years. Those have drastically decreased. So we're all using far less mercury, which is a good thing. DEHP is a plasticizer in PVC. It's also a hormone disruptor. Pharmaceuticals themselves are toxic chemicals in some cases. Flame retardants, sterilants, phthalates, pesticides, etc. And there are others, but these are sort of the ones that we end up working on. Nurses are second most exposed, and this is from several different sources, and it's very general. And thinking that the first most exposed employee group is janitorial staff. But this causes problems for us, for our patients, for our community and planet. So we've just returning to this circle, what I've talked about is the healthcare pollution. So what are these health impacts that I refer to? This is just a very, very broad, high-level list, and I don't think I'll read the entire list, but to point out that from energy, this is mostly from fossil fuel burning and largely from coal. There are various impacts that you know about, and folks living downwind of some of the power plants have worse trouble. Also, hydraulic fracturing, which is where we get most of our natural gas, causes other problems in terms of health impacts related to the pollution that it releases, as well as climate change impacts. Waste, we handle our waste pretty well in the U.S. We just have way too much of it. But if it's not handled well, there can be chemical exposures, hormone disruption from the different materials that are both in waste and the waste itself, infectious disease if you're not careful, and these planetary impacts, resource depletion. As we churn through our resources with our disposable products and world, we are spending the Earth's resources, and also climate change impacts, which I'll talk more about. Toxic chemicals is the area in environmental health that we know the most about, I would say, in terms of health impacts. They're called toxicants because they are toxic to life, and you know many of these conditions. There are also mental and emotional impacts from environmental harm, and we know this largely through the studies on climate change. From stress, depression, and anxiety, whether generalized or localized. We know that increased heat can bring more violence. And there are also community impacts in terms of community stress after forest fires or floods or terrible storms or changes in livelihood. Disaster response is terribly impactful. We hear every day more stories out of the fires in California and out of the floods in the Southeast, and migration being an expected and present outcome. There are also levels of impact, if this is helpful. Sometimes I get questions from nurses to say, well, what does that have to do with this patient in front of me? And so I think of it in this way. I don't know if this is helpful, but just to identify some things at these levels. So patient and family, what in terms of healthcare pollution can impact them? Cleaning chemicals. They may have difficulties with asthma or other respiratory issues. Phthalates in their plastic. We knew this from some of the early work with the NICU and infants that are exposed to high levels of plasticizers related to their body size. And it was hormone disruption to the degree that it disrupted the development of their sexual organs. Patients may experience poor quality food if a hospital hasn't tried to really advance that. And they may have air quality issues, especially diesel exhaust or cleaning equipment, etc. Local impacts outside of the hospital, hazardous waste may be an impact, the pharmaceuticals in water and soil. I often think about this. I live in Montana, and we know that there are pharmaceuticals in our high lakes. And you think, how did it get there? It's not volatilized. It doesn't get there by air. And so the thought is that it's humans and animals, and we spread whatever's in the water, basically. So that's a rather, it's a big scale. And then also we may be contributing to air pollution through our own generators. All hospitals have generators. They're often diesel, vehicles, autoclaves, etc. Okay, so now over to region. Again, back to power plants largely. It can impact an entire region. Forest fires in the summer impacts an entire region. Agricultural pollutants is really an indication of the larger agricultural system, but we're part of that, and because we serve a lot of food. And then water quality and quantity. It's said that hospitals, at least, are often the largest water users in a community. And then the planet, which is sometimes a hard one for nurses to make these connections to. And so I think it's helpful to think about this as impacts on planetary health. And there are a number of elements of planetary health. I would refer you to the Stockholm Resilience Center to look at planetary boundaries, a fantastic work that they've done over time. And I look at these three as climate change, resource depletion, and biodiversity loss as three of our planetary measures of planetary health that we are impacting in healthcare, particularly. Okay, so now we're back to this cycle, and what I want to talk about is this place here at the bottom with the lightning rod, because that's what we can interrupt. So what are some solutions? First of all, the title of this talk today is about green teams, so I want to at least talk a little bit about green teams. This is a definition I found online. I think it's pretty accurate because green teams are often self-organized and grassroots, often volunteers who really come together out of passion but want to address some of these issues, and it's fantastic that they exist. When is a green team needed? So I was thinking through sort of the life of organizational development in this area, and I was thinking at first, when there's really no action, there's no green team. There's no one is called to it, no one's doing it, and this is the case in many hospitals, unfortunately. Then there may be a time when people are actually frustrated and want to do something, and so they begin to come together, and it's really all grassroots. It's all volunteer, or it's people trying to organize from outside of the typical power structures. And that's kind of the beginning of a progress. And then as time goes on, maybe the organization starts to add some commitment, like in strategic planning, or maybe a little bit of a staff role, or they agree to work on energy conservation or recycling, but still mostly volunteer. And then maybe it moves on into mostly staff functions, and the organization is contributing significantly. Maybe they have a sustainability coordinator or an entire sustainability department with directors, managers, etc., who work across the different disciplines. But still some volunteers who help. And then at the end here, when environmental stewardship is hardwired, perhaps no green team is needed. Now, I personally have not seen that, and I've just looked at lots and lots of hospitals and talked with lots of leaders across the country. But I think it's possible, and I think that is the goal. And I think of this, some of you this may make sense to you. I think about it a little bit like infection control. I've been a nurse 30 years, and early on in my career, I really think it was more of an afterthought. We didn't even always have someone committed to it. We didn't take hand washing all that seriously. We knew we should, but it wasn't all that serious. And I think there was a belief that, well, people are going to get an infection if they come to the hospital. Not very many people, but some people are. And we accepted that. That is not the case today. And so you all know, if you work in hospitals, that it is pretty much the top priority in some cases. And it is embedded in everything we do. We track all sorts of data about it. We have professionals committed to it, and it's a part of every discussion, including what flooring we purchase. Well, how well can it be cleaned? So I think in time, this may happen with environmental stewardship as more and more people realize that we're causing that harm to health that I mentioned earlier, and also, by the way, that this saves a lot of money. So that's just a thought about green teams. Oops. Sorry. Went black there. Okay, so how are green teams structured? Well, this varies a lot, and it is all over the board. So I listed 3 types that I'm familiar with, one of which being some sort of centralized team with regular meetings. And so all the key disciplines meet regularly. Often this is headed by a sustainability office, and it's organized, and there are staff. Another way to do it is with specific team meetings. For instance, the OR may have a greening the OR team. The lab may have issues that they want to handle in the lab area. And then often there would be someone, for instance, a sustainability coordinator, who would help pull those different groups together when needed, help work with each individual group and bring that forward to the senior leadership when necessary. Or there's others, diffuse meetings. Maybe it's a little bit more hit or miss. All of them can be effective to different degrees. I think it depends a bit on the bandwidth, the staff, and the culture of the organization as to how they intend to do that. I've been very impressed watching across the nation different organizations and how successful they are. And one of the most successful groups right now is the VA. And that's partly because the VA was mandated by their leadership that they wanted to address environmental stewardship, largely because it drives efficiencies and saves money, but also because it's the right thing to do for the nation. And so that is a very different structure probably than a community hospital. But there are lots of ways to do it. Who are typical members of the Green Team? And I've listed common departments, and this too would vary by how each organization is set up. This also applies to non-hospitals. It applies to clinic areas. It applies to universities. It applies to organizations. It could apply to schools and churches, things of that nature, because the mitigation work, meaning the pollution reducing work we're doing, is really the same. It's just probably a bit more complex in a hospital. So you need a leader or two of your Green Team. Sustainability department, if you have that. An executive sponsor is always important. Who is the exec that's going to be held accountable? Facilities, meaning the engineering staff, purchasing, environmental services, that means the janitorial staff, food and nutrition, nursing, clinical, marketing, communications, mission, if you're a mission-based organization. So these are typical members, but certainly not the only members. We use a lot of process improvement folks in our work here. That's super helpful. Some of the structural pieces would be to have charter, and on that charter you have goals, annual goals with metrics. What are you going to measure and how do you know you're successful? Some way to share documents, so you have to have some way of communicating, and this would go along with whatever else your organization has. And communication trees or streams, and really the documents that you need for communication. And then another big piece of the structure, as mentioned, is measuring success. So there are lots and lots of metrics, and we have national benchmarks. As mentioned, I'm in a 50 hospital system. We have system-wide benchmarks. So it's really important to use data, get the data in front of people. People respond to it well. And besides, how else do you know where you're going or how you're getting there if you don't? So these are just some other things listed out: unit-specific goals, levels of participation, and also recognition, which helps both the hospital and the individuals who are working hard in this area. These are just some common elements that are addressed, and this is basically what was already mentioned as the sources of pollution. So these are the things that are commonly addressed in a stewardship program. Energy conservation, particularly, because that is truly low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of waste. Renewable energy to the extent possible. And this is the shifting sands, really, because 10 years ago, I'd say the primary way to approach renewable energy was on-site. So installing solar panels, sometimes wind, geothermal heat, etc. We have groundwater cooling here, which really saves a lot of money and energy in our summer times. But as renewable energy is more available and as bigger utilities are providing it, what I'm seeing is more health systems are moving toward purchasing renewable energy offsite. Water conservation, waste reduction, segregation, I'm going to talk more about that. The chemicals, as we've mentioned. Healthy and sustainable foods is a big piece of this work. Green building, and that's both in new buildings and in remodels. Sustainable transportation is big as well, and education. And then these elements in red across the bottom are tools, tools that help drive it forward. The metrics I mentioned, always reporting out cost savings because everybody in leadership is interested in that, providing some recognition and figuring out how you're going to do that, some of which is through national award applications like Practice Green Health, and communication. Everything hinges on communication. So I wanted to talk about nursing particularly. This is where I spend my effort and my research effort as well. Remember that we have a scope and standard of practice, standards of practice, and standard 17 states this: the registered nurse practices in an environmentally safe and healthy manner. So I take this to mean we should not pollute. I also think I describe nursing as, between 30 to 40% of the workforce in healthcare, by far the largest profession in terms of numbers, about 4 million licensed registered nurses right now. And therefore, we are contributing to healthcare pollution. So we need to clean up what we can. And I don't want that to be interpreted as blame. That's not my point. It's more interpreting it as empowerment. So what can nurses do? Well, as leaders, nurses can do a lot. So many of you on the call today might be leaders in this way. It can be someone formally leading a sustainability program like myself or many nurses around the nation that I know of, but it could be leadership from the formal leaders in the hospital, the CNO, the managers, the directors who are interested in this and want to help take it forward. All of us can be leaders in our work units, whether it's a hospital unit or a university department or wherever. And so that's not to be underestimated. As content experts in the clinical world, we are the experts. For instance, right now we're working on turning off some of our procedural areas that are not used at night. So we're wanting to decrease the HVAC and the lighting. So who needs to be part of that discussion? Nurses, because nurses know the clinical flow, the clinical necessities, etc. So there are ways to contribute to any decision. Clinical waste reduction and segregation, I'll talk a little bit more about, but I think nurses touch most waste in the hospital, most waste streams, and actually most waste probably. So segregation is really largely up to us, and it matters. It matters to both save environmental burden and also cost. Reduction of chemicals, especially as nurses are exposed to these chemicals, it's important for us to understand that, to understand the health impacts, and to see what we can do about it, both locally and across the nation. Nurses are often people who advocate for healthy and sustainable foods. I read story after story about this, and it's exciting, both pushing for local foods, for bringing community-supported agriculture shares into a hospital, for gardens, farmers markets, for partnering with your local organizations such as food banks or other farmers markets, etc. Sustainable commuting, this varies a lot by the availability of sustainable commuting, and yet this is a place where nurses participate and can often lead this work. And then many people look to us for education, important. I think nurses are also terrific communicators. We do it all the time between disciplines, and this is an important way for us to contribute as we really help to build this culture of conservation and of taking care of this aspect of our professionalism. And we need to do so, we need to ensure that it's effective and consistent. So sometimes people have nursing-specific green teams. So we have a shared governance council here. We're a magnet hospital and a strong shared governance structure. And so we just added a green team shared governance council last year. And I think it's super great because it's mostly nurses. It's open to all disciplines, but they are handling those things that are difficult for everyone else to do because it's kind of nursing specific. I serve, as I mentioned, on a number of groups in my health system, and I'm the only nurse often. So I'm working with engineers, with EVS folks, with food and nutrition folks, with directors, with mission leaders, etc. And over the years, I've heard this phrase an awful lot. Well, that's clinical. We can't do much about that. And I have always said, well, wait a minute. The healthcare is clinical. What are you saying? But we need to help translate that. So that's really an opportunity for nursing because we are the experts. So some of the things that nursing specific teams can work on are energy efficiency in the clinical sites. So that example I gave about HVAC shutdowns in procedural areas, that's an example. Also figuring out and working with your facility staff to determine what is the lowest energy use in a patient room when the room is empty. What settings should we leave? Should we unplug the bed or should we leave the bed plugged in, etc.? Things like that. Waste reduction, as mentioned, and segregation, that's a lot of that's on us. Conservation, especially in the clinical areas, that paper, linen, clinical supplies can come up. We have been collecting clinical supplies out of the patient rooms that would normally be thrown away. And we now have them going into a variety of waste streams, one of which is to our Global Partnerships program, which goes around the world. Another, and that's for new, unopened, clean things that were never in an isolation room. Then we have other things that have been opened, but they're still in good shape. And we found that our animal control and several veterinarians would like that. So we collect that for them. In this process, we found all sorts of very clean new things like syringes wrapped in their original wrapper, or alcohol wipes that aren't open. And so we collected enough of these, and this is the green team, and said, why are we throwing all this away? It's really brand new. There must be a reason. So we went to the managers and our infection control person and learned that we had real mixed messaging about it. So different units behave differently in this regard. And some people thought that if it was ever in a room, you had to throw it out. And other people thought, no, only if it's in isolation do you have to do that. So then sometimes they were putting sort of gross stuff into the bins. So we straightened that out, and we developed a plan for restocking, when we can actually restock and when we can't. So that took a whole lot of nursing contribution, but it's going to end up saving thousands of pounds of supplies and many, many dollars. So that's an example. Moving more toward reusables, are there ways that we can replace, for instance, plastic isolation gowns with linen isolation gowns? And we've done that in some of our areas. Dishware, disposable dishware, can we push, nurses push, that we don't use disposable dishware in our clinical areas or in our cafeterias? Patient care items, are there other options for not using so many disposables? We've moved to disposables in the last, 40 years, and we're drowning in them now, all around the world and our oceans as well. So we'd like to move back to using less disposable single-use items. I mentioned the foods and a little bit of transportation. This last thing is NSEIs. Now, I'm sure you've heard of NSIs. That's nurse-sensitive indicators. Nurse-sensitive indicators are quality measures that are thought to be influenced strongly by nursing. So CAUTI, CLABSI, falls with injury, pressure ulcers, others like that are kind of on nursing. So nursing owns those, really works on those quality outcomes. So I propose that there are also nurse-sensitive environmental indicators. And it's really in this area of what is strongly smack dab in the scope of nursing that we can really impact. So I'm looking to develop that list and also the outcomes that could go with that. This is just an example of a waste segregation sheet. I hope that every hospital has this. I fear that they do not, because when I start to ask people what do they do with X, Y, or Z, not at our hospital, but at others, people haven't heard of a lot of these categories. This is important. This is part of it's part of our job, and it's in our scope of practice to handle these materials safely. Also, I just wanted to point out that conservation typically saves money. As mentioned, this is the cost of different waste streams from where I live in Missoula, Montana. This is not universal. You'd have to look this up in your area. But you can see that while landfill is not terribly expensive, it's twice as expensive as recycling. And it's also twice as expensive as composting. So we want to drive things to those streams that are both less expensive and environmentally preferred. And at the bottom, that's just a roll-up of annual savings from our years of energy conservation. We save about $400,000 a year from optimizing our waste. So doing these things I've discussed with you, we save almost $250,000. And reprocessing, which is it's a program where you can send single-use items, a controlled list that's FDA approved of single-use items for reprocessing by companies that are licensed to do so. And then you can buy back reprocessed items that cost about half the price. So through that, we save a lot of money, and we're missing about another $100,000 in savings. So I round this up to about $1 million a year. And, we're a small hospital, 250 beds. So other bigger hospitals would save much more. So I want to just talk through some categories, and I'm going to go kind of fast through this. This waste here is what we already discussed. Whatever is in the red circle is what I think is a little bit nurse sensitive. We talked about segregation and source reduction, and then some of the ideas for using less. One I didn't mention is reformulating kits, which is often in the OR or cath lab or ER, even ICU. Because if you ask the nurses there, or yourself, when they open a kit and use something, they rarely use everything. So we're throwing that away. It's good new stuff we're throwing away. And I've just identified some of the climate impacts in each category here. Waste in landfills contributes methane. That's a potent, longer-lasting greenhouse gas that we want to minimize. We also, if we overuse, then we're overproducing. We have to pay for the shipping. We're spending the fuel on that, et cetera. That contributes to greenhouse gases as well. And again, that resource depletion problem I mentioned earlier. So energy and water, we know we've already talked about some of the health impacts of that, and some of the opportunities that we can work on. renewable energy sources, that's kind of a harder one for nurses to work on. Really, we need our facilities folks, though we can ask them to do that. That's legitimate for us to say we need to practice in an organization that is environmentally safe and healthy in order to meet our professional guidelines. Could you please help us? But we can work on energy conservation through our own efficiency and behaviors as well as water. So we know the climate impacts of this area the most. Fossil fuel burning is the primary driver. Coal is most polluting, but also water actually takes a fair amount of energy to treat and move. Ag and food. So we waste a lot of food in our country, 30 to 40%. Is that astonishing? And that's 161 billion a year. And also food waste in landfill is thought to be about 8% of greenhouse gas emissions. So what can we do? Well, all those things that we've talked about earlier, as well as helping our kitchens, if they're not already working on food waste, to address that. That's both on the production side, because whatever they waste, like if they cut off too much of the carrot, then they're paying for that. So they don't want to do that. But also on the consumer side, can we collect it for composting? Because composting is better than putting it in the landfill, and it's better, is cheaper as well. So climate impacts of ag and food, you know about some of this already. Animal agriculture is particularly an issue. And land use is important because we chew up the land in order to grow more food, but therefore we lose some of our carbon sequestration opportunities. Chemicals, I've mentioned that some of these are chemicals of concern in healthcare. Our opportunities, and again, the ones in circles are really what I've thought of as more nurse sensitive. We do need to protect ourselves. So that means learning about these risks and using proper protection. Organizations may be really on top of this and on your team here, and they may not. So it's important, I think, for nurses to dig into this a little bit. Also, we can start to ask for, in our decision making that our organizations make, do you really need that harmful chemical? Let's see why. Sometimes we do. Sometimes for the sterilants and the disinfectants, it's hard to get around the need for some harsh chemicals. But sometimes they're just used in a blanket manner. I really thought there weren't many climate impacts of chemicals, but I was wrong. I mean, waste anesthesia gas, we could put that elsewhere, but if we put it in this category, we've been working on this a lot in our health system and have reduced our waste anesthesia gas significantly. Some of the elements, particularly a drug called desflurane, is very, very potent. It's potent and long-lasting, sometimes up to 3,600 times as potent as CO2. So a tiny little bit of anesthesia gas can have an outsized impact on climate. And the truth is, it is scavenged out of the rooms so that people in the rooms aren't exposed, but then it's vented straight into the atmosphere. So it's very rarely scavenged before going into the atmosphere. There are companies in other countries who have products available, but they're not FDA approved here yet for distilling that and reusing. So it's very expensive at this point. Some of these other chemicals that we use for other purposes are also greenhouse gas emitters. So I just listed those there. As mentioned, transportation has passed buildings now as the largest source of greenhouse gases. And a lot of times hospitals and other employers say, well, that's on the employee. That's not up to us. We can't do anything about that. And I often have to say, well, would the employees be driving those miles if they weren't coming to work for your organization? So there's some shared responsibility here, I think. And many hospitals are working on this. Some are required to by their state, like Washington State, which is great. But looking at sustainable transportation, public transportation, incentives for people not using their own vehicle, that's a single occupancy vehicle on there. What can we do? We can educate ourselves about it, encourage ourselves, see what we can do to reduce our personal dependency on single occupancy vehicles. And in larger cities with ride sharing, this is getting easier. So we know it's a huge contributor to climate change, as well as significant air pollution. We also know that electric vehicles are coming. We see it all the time. If you're like me, you read every article that comes out about that because I don't want to buy another vehicle until I feel better about them. But we need the grid to be renewable, or we're going to still be burning coal to run our cars. Okay, another category that I think talk about is engagement. So for advocacy and education, nurses play a huge role. We can educate ourselves and others, other professionals, plus colleagues, patients in our community. I think we need to include all always. So that's I talk about nursing, but really we are oftentimes the go-betweens, the connectors, the networkers in an organization. So really it's all disciplines at all levels and all the different departments. I think we have more division between departments than we do disciplines sometimes, because we'll say, oh, I don't know anything about birth and no babies, or something like that. Advocacy, we want to use our own powerful voice wherever we are in the workplace, professional organizations, community, and government. Another aspect of engagement is some opportunities that I hope you all know about, but I want to just talk a bit about them. So the Nurses Climate Challenge, I hope everyone knows. Dr. Shanda Demarest, who's from the University of Minnesota, was the lead developer of this, but both Kara, who welcomed us to the call, and myself and others from Healthcare Without Harm have worked on this. And this is a set of tools that are available to nurses to use to educate other healthcare professionals about climate and health, particularly. And there's a short version that's about 10 minutes and a longer version that's about 30 minutes. And there's resources to go with each. So please check that out and register and teach others. Another opportunity is the chant, and I'm going to show you more about that, and the NEAT. So let me move to my slides. This is the Nurses Climate Challenge landing page, and you can get to it through that link there at the bottom. I imagine you might have to just type it in, because I don't think the PDF will be linked. And as mentioned, there's easy instructions to follow. So please consider doing that. The chant is the climate health and nursing tool, and also Kara and Dr. Demarest and myself and Dr. Berduli from Washington State have developed this. And it's the climate health and nursing tool, which is trying to measure nurses' perceptions, motivations, and behaviors regarding climate and health. It is something that we ask nurses to take every year. We just relaunched the revised version in early January, so you can find that on the ANNI website, which is environ.org, and search for the survey or for chant. And please share that. That would be terrific. Also, the Nurses Environmental Awareness Tool. Since I'm talking today, this is another thing that I've worked on, so I'm telling you about it. It's a survey tool with 6 scales that measure nurses' awareness of these common impacts and pollution, really, of healthcare, how related they think it is to health, so it's an awareness. What do they do about it at work, and how easy or difficult is that? And what do they do about it at home, and how easy or difficult? I'm doing a study right now with this with 7 hospitals and already have about 1,000 responses, and just super interesting. Usually, if people are doing something at home, it parallels with at work, but oftentimes not nearly as much. For the most part, nurses are pretty aware of the health impacts, and I'm comparing this to a study I did 6 years ago, and I haven't looked at that yet, but we'll be interested to see if things have changed over time. And sometimes people use this if they do a project in their hospital, they want to, do some education, they might offer the NEAT before and after. So if you're interested, just let me know. And a few more things. We have coming up the Nurses Summit on Environmental Health. So this is, Annie is sponsoring this, and we're doing it in conjunction with CleanMed, which is the national conference every year that Healthcare Without Harm puts on. If you haven't ever attended or been a part of that, please check that out. It's a fantastic conference. And this is our second summit. I thought last year was just really inspiring and great networking. I've been in touch with many of the people I met last year. And so that's happening in Nashville on May 6th and 7th, and you can learn more at the cleanmed.org website. So please consider attending that. Also, if you haven't heard the Nurses for Healthy Environments podcast, again, this is something I do, so naturally I know about it. I want you to listen. And I've interviewed, I'm sure, some of you on the phone here today or on the webinar. And so I try and post one every 2 weeks. And it's just interviewing nurses who are working in this area at the intersection of health and environment. And it's been just so interesting to listen to what's happening around our country, and also so far Canada, UK, Finland. I have a session coming up from Sweden and another session coming up from Australia. And it's really inspiring and really powerful, effective nurses doing significant work. So I've really enjoyed that. These are just some resources that are available. They're not linked here, but you would be able to look these up if you're not familiar with them. And there are others. I think that Practice Green Health, particularly in terms of the content area of environmental stewardship, is a real leader. And it is a member organization, so you get additional materials if you're a member. But without being a member, there's a lot of free, open, available materials. And that is the content that I wanted to deliver today. And so if there are questions, I'd love to entertain them and also invite you to contact me if you would like to. Thank you.
Yeah, and everyone, just a reminder that if you'd like to ask a question, just type it in the attendee chat box, which should be on the left-hand side of your screen. And we do have some comments. Really liked that mental health impacts were noted in your slides. Usually the comment was that it's usually not acknowledged, and I think that's a really good point that I think until probably the past year or two that we really started to see mental health as an impact related to climate change. So it is really important that we continue to recognize that as an impact and educate people on that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, it's interesting, the specifics of folks with existing mental health challenges and also new onsets of mental health challenges related to this. And then the community stress challenges. It's just incredible to think about the mental health challenges after a town has been decimated by fire. It's kind of overwhelming. I will throw out the word also solastalgia that some of you may have heard about, which is basically grieving for home, but it's in an environmental sense. So it's the sense of loss over what we have perceived as our stable natural condition, and it can really cause anxiety and grief and sadness. And it's one of the things that those of us working in this area, I think, have to wrestle with a bit to maintain our own resilience. So thank you.
Yeah, we had another comment about fluorescent lights. It was saying that it costs more to turn the fluorescent on and off, so maybe it's more economical and energy efficient to leave it on. I don't know if you have a comment for that.
Well, I looked into that a few years ago, and it seems to be a bit of a moving target. So it would be good to look at the lights that you have, because oftentimes now we've moved beyond fluorescent to LED, and it probably is time for another review of that literature. So anyway, I would just leave it at that. I don't have a final answer for it, but it's important to think about the specifics where you are. Same thing with computer power management. What's going to be the best, in an organization? I'd work with your IT department. Should you be turning things on and off all the time or not? We have specific instructions here at our organization. They do not want us to turn off the processors, but they do say, yeah, you can turn off the monitors. And this is a group in our region, we're really working hard to bring in computer power management software. And that is software that can be loaded into entire gigantic systems of thousands of computers and manage the power for you. It can save lots and lots of energy and therefore money. So I think you're right to really look at the specifics. It's because unfortunately it's all complex and there are local situations.
That's a great point. The other question comes in about the podcast. Is the podcast available in transcript form? I know I won't have time to listen, but I would love to read it and skim it.
Well, gosh, it's not now. I don't know how to do that. Do you know how to do that, Kara?
No, well, that's a good question. We haven't been asked that, but we should look into it. So thank you for bringing that up. And this is an interesting question. I was disappointed to read the research that showed bed linens cannot be cleaned of E. coli. They cannot be sterilized sufficiently. How can we change that?
Yeah, I was alarmed by that too, so I immediately sent it. This came out, I don't know, not last fall, maybe. So I sent it immediately to our infection control person, and she works at our system level. She's a nurse, works at our system level, and that a lot of experts are addressing those needs that we have. And she said that she was not worried about it. Now, I can't tell you the exact details of it, but it may be specific to different laundries and protocols, but um, so I don't know enough to tell you why. And I think, always we do have to be concerned about um, whether or not we're creating more harm. But at least for us here, it was not something to worry about. And she had checked it out with our laundry. So it's not inevitable, I guess is what I'm saying. They can be cleaned properly of E. coli. They don't have to be go autoclaved, because we talked about that. I talked about that with her. Would we have to autoclave them? And she said you wouldn't. However, that brings me to another discussion about linen. And we've been working hard on linen reduction here because our laundry director says about a third of our linen that he washes is clean. And that is because it gets overstocked in the rooms. So we have not, we don't say, I told you earlier that we can restock certain supplies if they're clean, wrapped, and undisturbed, but we don't say that about linen because it's just too much open to the ambient air in the room, and we don't know what, company patient visitors have done or anything like that. So we've been trying to reduce that, and one of our nurses has really taken a lead on it, and she's doing, in the end, a research study right now to look at the use of a protocol. And that's because she couldn't find good literature really anywhere about, can we go to every other day linen changes? Can we change just the pillowcase and draw sheet? And what would that do to microbial load? So there's just not a lot out there on that. So I suspect that this question about the E. coli is somewhat related to there needs to be a little bit more research. We need better guidelines about it. But I'm excited about her study, and she will know. She's comparing 2 units with the protocol to 2 units without the protocol, and we'll see about that. So I hope later this fall we'll have some information.
Okay, excellent. And then our next question is really about the logistics of forming a green team. So what's a good way to initiate a green team committee at my hospital to facilitate change? What would be the first step to take to make an impact?
Well, I'd say it depends a little bit on your circumstances. Like, are you in the group where there's no green team because there's no action happening? Or is there some action happening that's just not well known? Because I'd say most engineering departments or facilities departments are working on conservation because of the financial need. So what I would say is, however it's possible, is you find a couple of like-minded people, and then you start to talk with your leaders, or if you're a leader, you start to figure that out among your peers as to how could we get together, how could we learn more about 2 things. One is what's possible, and the other is what are we doing currently. So it's basically a gap analysis to figure out where you might start. I think, it can be really overwhelming at first because there's so much. And the programs that I've described to you, those mature programs, have often been going for 20 years. So you can't expect to make changes overnight. But maybe there's one thing that really bugs you, like you're using styrofoam in your cafeteria. That's something that really none of us should be using because of styrene migration. It's not healthy to serve food in, especially hot food with fat content. So maybe it's styrofoam, or maybe it's recycling, or maybe it's linen. Maybe there's one project that you'd like to achieve some success at. The reason I say that is because to build one project, you end up needing to build a team and some structures and ways to communicate, etc. So I don't know if that is helpful for you that way. That's really the grassroots way. If you have a little bit more organization in your I don't know if you're in a hospital. You're in a hospital, then you could go to the leaders of those different groups. Like shared governance is really a good way for nurses to be involved. You can ask your chief nursing officer, hey, I heard this webinar, and did you know this is a professional obligation of ours? I want to get involved with this. What do you recommend? Or who should I talk to? And oftentimes if you're starting something, it takes a lot of footwork, and sometimes you get a lot of no. But I was told once by a professor that no is one step shorter, or one step closer to yes. And I have just operated on that principle, because if someone says no, then you have to say, okay, I have to reformulate. What am I going to ask differently? Who am I going to ask? Maybe I need to understand costs better, or understand feasibility better. So it makes your questions better. So try not to be too daunted by that, and keep after it.
Great. The next question is about the process for sharing the recorded webinar to public health students in class later this semester. So I'll send out an email after this webinar with a link to the recording. So you are welcome to share that with your students. We would love for you to share it, actually. And then we also will post it on the website so that you can access it at a later date. And that's under in our website under the tab Continuing Education. Another question for you, Beth, is would you say that the webinar topic is different in any way from planetary health, or would you say that it is a subtopic of planetary health?
Well, my bias is that everything in the world is a subtopic of planetary health. I mean, seriously, especially now at this time in our human history, it is incredible that we are in, what they call multi-system failure in terms of our planetary health. So I think it is a subset, and I think, however, it is not just for nurses, but for many humans, it is just too much to think about the whole. I think about the whole. I've come at this from the planetary level for a long time, but I realize I lose people when I talk about that only. So I've also really tried to build it from the bottom up, from people's experience and from what they're doing with their own hands and their own work, and especially nurses who are really, really wanting to help. It breaks our hearts that we hurt people. And when people realize that the pollution we're causing is actually hurting people, it's sometimes overwhelming to them. So I definitely think of it as a subtopic of planetary health, but I don't always find it helpful to present it that way. I did today, and I do often, especially more now. But I think it's just it's a communication issue a little bit, but I do think it's really about planetary health.
Right. And we talked a lot about sustainability in hospitals. Do you have any thoughts for those who work in home health or in long-term care facilities and how to reduce some of the waste in those areas?
Yeah, I think it would be similar, honestly, in terms of thinking of those categories. So you can think of it, the big three categories I think of are energy, waste, and toxic chemicals. So think about the energy. So for instance, in home health, are you using energy efficient fleets, your cars? Is there anything that you can teach patients about or your clients about in terms of energy efficiency for their home, which will save them money? Long-term care, same thing. I mean, it would be really working with facilities in a similar way and figuring out what are energy efficiency steps we could take. Waste, I think, same, both. I mean, all of us deal with clinical waste and with infectious waste probably. So you too need to understand the waste streams and how to segregate and what's safe. So I don't think that's terribly different either. Toxic chemicals, I think, again, to scan and see what are the chemicals that you may be more exposed to. And I personally don't know that, but you would know that as content experts, and to see what can be done. I think some of the organizational stuff is probably similar because you're working for organizations, and to, again, say this, talk with your leaders or your peers and say, is there something that we could work on, something that we could try and address? There's also the opportunity to use more renewables. So I don't know if, you could think through the products that you frequently use. Are there some that could be renewable rather than disposable? And that often saves money also for your organization, but at least for home health, that you'd have the transportation issue. So, but I imagine you haul waste away. You probably don't leave infectious waste with your clients. So I'm not a content expert, but I think it would be a very similar approach.
We have a question here about a good reference to help convince management of the importance to start a green team of greening healthcare, either whether it be a research paper, a position statement, a website to refer to, etc.
Well, definitely practice green health and healthcare without harm. They have also a leadership section, and they have some draft letters. I don't remember right now if that's a member part or a non-member part, but certainly poke around there. Very important. Also to, you can quote me as being at a small hospital, 250-bed hospital, saving about $1 million a year. They don't want to miss that if they're not. Now, I'm not saying that's all up to the green team because, as mentioned, facility staff will have been working on conservation, but there's a whole lot more to be gained besides that. So I think the the financial piece is important. And then, I think that paper I mentioned, which is Eckelman and Sherman, we can post that somehow, Kara, maybe. It's free. You don't need the library. It's a PLOS document. But anyway, that really spells out the case of healthcare pollution, the facts of healthcare pollution. So I think that's a good source. If you can get yourself or anybody else to go to CleanMed to learn more about it, if you can get one of your leaders to go somehow, that can be a life-changing experience if people haven't been paying attention to this. Those are some ideas.
Thanks, Beth. There's another comment here that clinical ladders are very helpful in moving environmental health forward. I received hospital recognition based on this. And I think that's a really good point. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. That's great. And that would be a great story to write up somehow because, I think like, for instance, the clinical specialty green teams is kind of new. And so getting recognition for in your clinical ladders is great. For an EBP project, we've done a few of those for this research study we're going to be doing now. I think to weave this into scholarship is really, really important. I mean, that's the other half of my work, which is at the university, that's what I try and do there. So I also do clinical scholarship in the hospital setting. So I'm totally think that's awesome. So good work.
We have a question about where is the research for the styrene health impacts?
You can just search for it. Search on styrene migration, and there's a lot. And the chemical lobbying group will debunk it. But if you go to the chemists and the papers on that, it's enough that it seems to me that it's using the precautionary principle. There's no need to use that when we have good evidence that it is a problem in terms of it's for the hot and fat-loving foods or fat-filled foods. So it's hydrophilic. Or it's fat-philic, whatever that is. So there's a lot of available research there. I don't have a source to just tell you right off the top of my head.
So we don't have any more questions, but I actually do have a question that I'd like you to expand on a little bit. So I think when it comes to something that tends to be a volunteer-based effort, you have issues with getting engagement and buy-in. And then especially with nurses, I think nurses have every good intention for attending a meeting during the day or, on their non-work days, but sometimes can get pulled in a million directions. So how have you worked to kind of overcome those barriers and really get nursing buy-in?
Well, it has, from my perspective, it has not been hard to get nursing buy-in. Now, it might be hard to get nurses to go to shared governance meetings, and it might be hard to get nurses to do things outside of their hours if they're not paid. That's true. But, I probably benefit from living in a small university town, and there's a lot of enthusiasm for this work. And when nurses realize that they can make a difference, I think it's a job satisfier. Now, I know that that's not the case everywhere, and I think that it's important to approach it from our professional obligation. And I also know that not every place really is very tuned into that. And so it's just true that some organizations are not as developed as others. This is what I've seen, not just in environmental stewardship, but in how well they treat their nurses, how well they include nurses, what sort of professional development opportunities there are. I mentioned we're a magnet hospital. I think that has been both a measure of success, it's demonstration that we are successful in these things, and also it pushes us. So that if you are a magnet hospital, if you work at a hospital at all, and if your hospital is magnet, that is a way in as well, because you can push on those professional obligations. But some nurses, don't really value our professional obligation. They might feel put upon a little bit. I think beyond that, it's appealing somewhat to their own values, to the health of the future for their children, to this ability to have an opportunity to make an impact. And also it can be fun. We have fun doing this work. So those are some ways.
Thanks, Beth. And real quick before we close out, do you have the name for the chemist resource that you mentioned? I believe that was probably with the styrene.
I just had used the phrase styrene migration. Is that what you meant? Maybe. So it's not a chemist, but it's a phrase you can Google on, or Google Scholar,
Oh,
or
yep,
library
that was
search.
it.
Okay. Okay.
All right. So with that, we're at 4 o'clock. So we'll close off the webinar. And just a reminder, you will receive an email with a link to the recording, as well as a link to complete the evaluation if you want the Nursing Continuing Education Hour. And once you complete the test, your certificate will pop up. So don't close the window too quickly, because that's how you'll need proof to show that you attended the webinar. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you found this helpful. And go forward and start your green teams in hospitals.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.